Good.
Good afternoon, everyone. For anybody who doesn't know me, I'm John DiCarlo. I'm Municipal Shared Services Director for NVCOG. I'm also Project Manager for the Regional Wastewater Treatment Consolidation Study. Thank you for coming. We look forward to a excellent dialogue with you in explaining the draft final report of this study with you. Just a housekeeping measure for anyone who came out of town. If you find yourself with a parking ticket, when you get back to your vehicle, please bring it back in here and we'll take care of it for you. The city, the town of Seymour has just instituted a new parking program, which is very effective. So we want to make sure that you're taken care of in that event. We'll introduce ourselves around the table and then everyone can say who they are and following here. We'll get started.
Oh, me. I'm Rick Dunn. I'm the Executive Director of Naugatuck+Valley Council of Governments.
Sarah Concanon, Director of Municipal Services at the Collins Center for Public.
I'm David Colton. I'm an associate with the public management.
Matt Powis with Black and Beach. Will Walkup with Black and Beach.
Mario Frantucci, project manager for Black and Beach.
You're going to have to speak louder today.
That's never been a problem.
Label, WPCA superintendent. Jack Walsh, chair of WPCA. Derby.
John Tomasola, Ansonia, WPCA, acting superintendent.
Walter Royal, Seymour, was the control for Veolia.
Tony Deserta, town of Seymour.
People we have online.
Rich Bashara, City of Ansonia.
Thank you, Rich.
Andrew Bafflet.
Stella Morrison, Connecticut DEP.
Carla Romo with Black and Beach.
And Stella.
And Andrew Becker.
What was the last one?
Andrew Becker.
No.
Stella.
Carla Romo.
Carla Romo from Black and Beach. Well, thank you all very much again. We'll hand it off to Mario to start the workshop, and you want to take questions as they arise?
Yes, yeah, so it's a workshop. So anytime you have any questions or I'm confusing you or you want some more information, just interrupt and we'll try to answer it as we go.
Mario, just some housekeeping. Richard, can you monitor hands up and ask people to raise their hand if they're online and they want to be recognized? Can we see the program at all? The remote people online?
People in the room to see
The presentation, yeah. Okay, if we're going right to it, is that what we're gonna do?
We should be using the.
Well, no, they're gonna see it.
I'm
Okay,
letting in George Hicks and Dan Moore.
thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
So would you like?
No, just answer that. But
Actually, it's on those screens. I'm not sure if anybody's looking at that.
Thank you.
Right. So go to the next slide. Okay, so we've provided a little bit of an agenda here on some of the things we'll talk about today. We've already had some introductions. We're going to provide a brief overview of the whole project, phase 1 and phase 2. We've been at this for a while. A lot of you have already been here listening to these presentations and workshops since the beginning, but we'll do a review of that. We're going to then review the recommended plan again, and I'll turn it over to Will, my colleague. He'll be talking about how we've done further development of the recommended plan, and then we'll turn it back over to me here at the end to talk a little bit about opportunities for clean water fund monies and regional entity setup. So again, we know that NVCOG is basically commissioned the study to Black and Beach, and we've been undertaking the work. And of course, all of you have been participating in the project since the beginning, from north to south, Naugatuck, Beacon Falls. I'm no longer, in the picture, but also Seymour, Ansonia, and Derby. And of course, we have very important DEEP and OPM who have been following the project. DEEP is the sponsor, OPM is the final decision making. So we'll talk about phase one. We started phase one in 2018. It's been a while. We're into our 4th year of this. So we'll move on. So I just wanted to give a snapshot of some of the deliverables and some of the major activities. We did a lot in phase one, but just kind of put kind of a stake in the ground on some of the things that we did. We started off with the flows and loads report, and purpose for that obviously is we wanted to understand what the demands were going to be for the 20-year planning period all the way out to 2040. We know that the state data center, one of their missions is to project population for future growth for all the cities and towns in state. So we took a close look at their information, but to us, as important as that was, we came to each of the communities, Derby, Ansonia, and Seymour, and we talked to all of you about, where are your plans going to be for the next 20 years? We want to understand that, because it's about size of the facilities. That's what we're talking about. So we wanted to make sure that we had those growth projections, rightly placed, and of course, growth projections relate to wastewater. So we also took a look at plant data. We have a lot of monitoring reports, daily monitoring reports, monthly monitoring reports. That gave us a basis from which to build the flows. And so we were able to develop good flows and loads, for the 20-year period for each of the plants. A little bit more complex to do, but we endeavored to do it. Also was to determine what the peak flows were, because a lot of our facilities are going to basically be designed around peak flow capacity, like for instance pumps and piping. Not all of the facilities that we design is centered on peak flows, but some of them are. So we wanted to understand what those were, and we looked at a lot of historical data. Historically, all the plants that communities that are represented in this room have very high peak flows. They may not occur on a day like today, on a sunny day in the 90s, but when it rains, it pours in those collection systems. And part of that is tied to basically the conditions, the pipes under the ground. So we did that. We also then did a condition assessment of all the plants and the collection system. We got a hold of as many reports as we could, any technical documents that we could get our hands on. We wanted to kind of develop kind of a statement of health, if you will, for all of these wastewater infrastructure systems, and collection systems, and the plants. We're looking at longevity. We're looking at life. We're looking at how much, what state of repair are we in? Is it affecting treatment? How is the condition of these plants affecting treatment? Is maintenance, operation and maintenance being just overly used because the equipment isn't new enough? So you're having to spend a lot more time at that. So we're trying to get a good handle of, what are we doing? What's going on at these plants? What's going on in collection systems? What's the life expectancy? That was very important to us, because you can hear me and Will talk about that here, because it's been a progression as we've gone on life. There's been a lot less available on the collection systems. I know Derby did at least an SSES study in mid 2014 or so, but there's still an awful lot of information that we would like to have been available on the collection systems, but it wasn't, but we have been able to, I'll just say, piece together a lot of information on the piping system. Derby's, for instance, is a very old system. Ansonia is an old system. Even Seymour is an old system. Pipes underground in the realm of 75 to 100 years is not uncommon, certainly in Derby, but even in Ansonia and across all three communities, 50 years or more is pretty common for pipe systems in the ground. A lot of the pipe systems in the ground, not all of them, but a lot, a good percentage of them. And that means they've run out of their usefulness, and there's a lot of renovation that needs to be done to the underground piping. So those two documents were quite formidable for us to kind of get a handle, get our arms around for the first time. What are we doing? Where are the facilities that we're going to be touching and analyzing? Where are they? Then what we did also as part of phase one, we started to string together from north to south, from Naugatuck to Beacon Falls, Seymour, Ansonia, and Derby. We started taking a look at how these communities could marry up to basically be brought together to form regional entities of sorts. So nothing was off the table, but some was off the table. Like, for instance, we didn't decide to go bring the Naugatuck plant down to Beacon Falls. That just didn't make too much sense right out the gate. So there was a sense of that we removed, but pretty much everything else was on the table. So we came up with 23 regional alternatives as part of phase one. And I think I also want to point out that we have had throughout this project a very consistent level of engagement from all of you. So we've had other workshops. I think we had a couple of workshops in phase one, but we also had numerous meetings. I remember just meeting with John and Rick at all of the CEO offices, to kind of review the project, and we had numerous meetings. So that was very important to us. We've always felt grounded by what we're doing because of that interaction. So this is just a list of the 23 regional alternatives that came out of phase one. No need to read them all because you folks have them. But we had 23 regional alternatives that we came up with. We referred to it as the long list that came out of phase one. That was the easy part, quite honestly. We're not done yet. So that was the outcome of phase one. In phase two, we know where we're at today, so we'll kind of start with the answer, and then we'll talk about how we did things. We came up with one essentially recommended alternative today. So how did we get there? We did that by conducting 3 key tasks as part of phase two. We've been at phase two since probably early last year, early 2020. That's when we really went hard at phase two. And task two was an incredible task because what we needed to do, we needed to melt down these alternatives, these 23 alternatives, into the more attractive ones, the ones that will keep us. We were looking at the ones that will keep us. So task two endeavored to do that. We did a lot of work. We had a workshop after task two. And we brought that down to 6 alternatives, from 23 down to 6. And then what we did and we did more development in task two. We started really looking at what these plant sites would look like. And as a matter of fact, what we were looking for was for fatal flaws. If we saw a fatal flaw, something that we couldn't really anchor ourselves into, then we would let it fall away. So I'll give just an example, just a quick example of what that means. Is, for instance, at Derby, it's a small plant site, and yet would it serve as a regional hub, as a regional treatment hub? And the answer that came out of task two was yes. We could actually make it fit under as a regional plant hub. So that we didn't look at costs of task two. So we came into task 3. And in task 3, what we did was we looked at even more. We looked at developing the alternatives even further, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to assign a cost. We had cost was always imperative in this project. As a matter of fact, the whole reason for this project, the whole reason why all of us have been here is it more attractive, financially attractive? Is it more financially attractive to regionalize, to come together and work together in terms of wastewater treatment and service, rather than stay alone as these communities, as a lot of communities, and certainly these communities, your communities, have been doing, for 100 years ago. So we looked at developing the alternatives further in task 3, and we looked at assigning costs to those alternatives, capital costs. We also developing operations and maintenance costs. And I know, but I Will knows, and I know that you know, how many questions, how many emails, how many meetings that we had with you, virtual meetings, certainly in phase 2, that we had to try to grab that information from you so that we can do something with it. We were not going to just develop costs. If we knew that you had a foundation, especially on O&M, we wanted to understand that why. We looked at our own databases. We don't have plans and specs while we develop these numbers. That's so a more complete cost estimate, a capital cost estimate is based on quantifying process with plan specifications. But on a planning level basis, we were still able to use a lot of good information that we have for our own databases, as well as understanding the configurations of your systems. For instance, one area that we probably could do better at in terms of costing is like, what are the site conditions? What are the actual site conditions? We get that from, for instance, from surveys like geotechnical programs. But we also look at what do you have right now? What kind of facilities do you have right now? So we made assumptions there where we had to project new facilities. So, and then what we did was we developed a comparative model so that we can compare all the regional alternatives to the base case. We use what's called the present worth model, which basically takes capital costs and takes the present worth of operations and maintenance costs and develops it into initial number that you can, in my own words, it's a number that basically represents an investment that if you look at the life of this program and at a particular interest rate with these costs, that it would basically an initial number that if you finance it properly, that could cover the entire cost of the program. So it's a good number that allows you to compare apples to apples, taking capital costs and O&M into account. And then in task 4, as I said, we'll review more of that, but we've done even more development of the recommended alternative alone. Okay, and as I said before, the task 2 summary, what we did there was we took that long list and we developed those alternatives, but not a whole lot, not as much as we did to the 6 shortlisted ones, and not as much as we did for the recommended alternatives. But we still reviewed all of those alternatives, analyzed them, developed them, and were able to go from 23 regional alternatives to 6 shortlist regional alternatives. And the ones that we basically eliminated or screened out were the alternatives that called for aggressive I&I control. And we worked real hard at that. And at the end of the day, the reason we eliminated that was because we couldn't really, even though aggressive I&I has been done successfully, it wasn't something that we could say, those are the ones that are going to make it here at the end. We couldn't say that. And then we also removed alternatives that basically started from Beacon Falls going north to Naugatuck, or from Beacon Falls going south to Seymour. And the reason we did that was because the Conveyance pipeline corridor going north and south was, first of all, quite honestly, it lacked a lot of reliability. That's a real mountainous region going north, quite honestly, going south as well. from Beacon Falls, numerous pumping stations. We counted up to 4, 5 pumping stations, not uncommon in either direction, going north or going south. And also the cost of that infrastructure just made alternatives that started at Beacon Falls not very effective. And these are the alternatives that came out of the task 2 report. 6 alternatives, 4 of them were pretty much centered at Ansonia. Basically, you have Ansonia basically receiving Derby flow, or Ansonia receiving Derby flow and Seymour flow. And then there's 2 sister alternatives to that, where you basically do full treatment at Ansonia and discharge treated effluent to the Naugatuck River, or the alternative would be to avoid doing phosphorus treatment and discharge to the Housatonic River at Derby. And then we had 2 regional alternatives for Derby as well that came out of task 2. One was just to receive Ansonia wastewater flows, and the other one was to receive both Derby, both Ansonia and Seymour wastewater flows. And so for task 3, that's basically what we did. We basically developed a lot of the alternatives. We developed the alternatives further. We wanted, as I said before, we wanted to get a good handle, start developing a picture so that we could judiciously create a planning level budget cost for those facilities, and then come up with a facility cost. We did the same thing for the conveyance pipelines as well. And so we basically developed essentially, we came out with actually 2 finalist alternatives coming out of task 3. The ones that fell away were the Derby regional alternatives. No news to anybody, I don't think, in this room. But the Ansonia regional alternative that had less cost and had the combination of less cost and more environmental benefit was the one that had both Derby and Seymour coming to it for treatment. So that's what we concluded here at the end of task 3. And this slide is a slide that you've seen before. This basically presents the present worth cost picture for all of the 6 regional alternatives. And we're looking at we've got this broken down into capital cost, present worth of O&M cost, and then total present worth. The lower the present worth value here, the better. And then what we have on the right side of the table is we have the exact same thing for the base case scenario, where you're going to stay and do things alone as without regionalization as you're presently doing. We have the capital cost, we have the present worth of the O&M, and we have the total present worth cost. The very last column is the difference between the regional alternative present worth and the base case present worth. And you can see the numbers in red. It shows that the regional alternative cost is even greater than the base case cost. And that's the case for the Derby regional alternative. So those ones fell away, and the 4 that remained were the ones centered at Ansonia. And as you can see, the 2 closest ones were 4 and 5B. 4 and 5B. 4 was Ansonia taking Derby, and the 5B was Ansonia taking Derby and Seymour. You see there's a slight edge in cost by about $3 million worth of present worth value for 4. But even at this stage, we both would be keepers, but we felt that 5B was even more attractive because it eliminated a second discharge altogether. So that was what came out of task 3. The Ansonia regional alternatives were financially more attractive than either the Derby regional alternatives and the base case. And 4 and 5 were the financially more attractive ones. And the Derby and Ansonia and Seymour alternative with pumping back to the Housatonic added the additional advantage of eliminating 2 wastewater treatment plant outfalls and not providing that additional treatment at Ansonia for phosphorus. So that's last time we met, we brought it to this point right here. And I'm going to turn it over to Will here in a minute, but I said an awful lot. I tried to compress 2.5 years worth of work in about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. I felt it was important to just kind of remind us where we've been and kind of how we got there. But is there any questions before Will goes over what we've done since we were last together?
Yeah, Johnny and Sonia. We have a high phosphorus number, 1.09. To dig a line back to the Housatonic is more cost effective than running the chemical for phosphorus removal?
Yeah, actually.
Over what, 30-year period?
Actually, maybe I didn't make this clear, but once we bring the discharge back to the Housatonic, we no longer have to provide phosphorus
Oh,
treatment.
I know, that's what I'm asking you.
Yes,
If we discharge where we have it now in Naugatuck,
yeah,
we remove phosphorus.
yes.
We have a higher limit. I don't know if the state would give us a lower limit because we're tying in the 3 times, probably not. And my question is, doesn't it cost a lot of money to put another pipe in and go all the way to the Housatonic?
Go to the previous slide, please. One further back. The answer is no. The answer is no, because you can see right here that keeping Derby and Ansonia to Derby and Seymour to Ansonia, the difference is about $14 million, 13 and change here, versus the base case, but it becomes more attractive by about $9 million.
We need attractive, I don't understand.
Less cost.
I can just tell you on layman terms is we do about $20,000 to $25,000 a year in process removal, and it's seasonal. Well, that's all I'm saying. So how much more can it be with them?
Yeah,
I mean,
to
us-
clarify, there would be a new phosphorus treatment facility that would be required bringing in the 2 new towns. So that's the offset. It's basically the cost of the pipeline is less than the cost of the treatment facility.
Oh, so instead of
Yes, because of the
phosphorus
additional-
removal, thank you. That's that.
Yeah, you'd have to be putting in a new treatment facility.
Yes.
Yeah.
for phosphorus. Not what you're doing right
No, they couldn't do it with the
now. No, because you're basically, your wastewater allocation for phosphorus is also going to stay where you're at, but you're gonna have a lot more phosphorus to remove.
yeah.
If I could just, one other point on that, aren't you also running new connecting pipe between those 2 facilities anyway?
Yes.
Regardless, you're running the pipe.
Right, yeah.
So,
So you get the added benefit of being able to do them both at the same
Same
time.
time, right? Just add another pipe instead of another dig. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
I have a question, Rich Bashara.
Yes.
go ahead.
On the 22 million or the 25 million in savings, is there a breakout by town or city?
That is being worked on.
We're gonna look at other slides later on that have the breakouts. We're looking at those today.
No, but we're gonna have that conversation. We're gonna start that conversation this afternoon and we will finish it up at our final workshop.
Okay,
There are no secrets though, Rich. It's all available. We're just having some difficulty in presenting it and coming up with equitable cost share proposals for consolidation.
okay, and am I understanding correctly that the only variation between the regional versus the individual is like a 5% additional grant process savings?
We're gonna get into that. We're gonna get into that, Rich.
Okay, I'll wait till the numbers piece then. Thank you.
Okay, so if there's nothing else, will present for a while here on task force.
All right, so yeah, Mario took us through task 4, which basically defined our treatment needs and our conveyance needs. I'm sorry, task 3. And so for task 4, what we focused on was construction, implementability, as well as process implementability. And part of that was to confirm some of the general assumptions we had to make along the way, but ultimately allowed us to build a schedule, a program schedule for this whole project, which I'll present at the end. So I'll go through, this block diagram shows the entire regional system. Basically, the collection systems for each of the 3 towns will terminate where they do now. Ansonia, of course, being a regional facility, it terminates there right ahead of the screens. At Derby, their conveyance, or the influent pump station would be converted to a conveyance pump station. There's screening upstream of those pumps, which is perfect for conveyance because you want to be able to remove as much of that material as you can. I think everyone in the room knows that. And then for Seymour, it'll be the same thing, but they get an added benefit of actually having the grit removal uphead of the pump, upstream of the pumps as well. So that water will have a preliminary treatment done before it gets pumped down to Ansonia. And the rest of the process at Ansonia will remain largely the same. Really, the modifications would be associated with bringing in these new pipelines, as well as a couple of condition-related changes as well. Next slide. So here's just a conceptual design drawing of the new Ansonia layout. I'm going to go through this process by process. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because we've talked about these upgrades a lot, and just didn't want to bog down the conversation today. So feel free to slow me down if you have any questions at all. But I'll start with the head of the plant. Like I said, Ansonia, the collection system terminates right there ahead of the screens. This will be in the headworks facility. You want to go to the next slide? There's only one screen at that facility right now, and so regardless of regionalization, we recommend that an additional unit be added. And this is a good opportunity to also upsize that for hydraulic capacity if it's needed to terminate any of those other lines from either Derby and or Seymour upstream of those screens as well. But otherwise, there's some nice channel works in there and some existing gates that can be utilized for the phasing of that work, as well as, more importantly, even phasing bringing those new pipelines in, because you're essentially going to be tripling the plant capacity. And so those peak flows are going to be coming in really hard. And a lot of that channel work in there is pretty small and a lot of tight turns. So we're going to need to be creative in making that work. Next slide. Just returning back to the main drawing here. Within the headworks and kind of part of the service building, the influent pump station is located, so that's downstream of the screens. We anticipate that in any case, we will have to upgrade those pumps to handle all 3 towns. It may be possible that Seymour, because grit is being removed at the facility as is, that it could terminate downstream grit removal at Ansonia. But that's likely going to be too high on the hydraulic grade line, since those influent pumps are bringing the water all the way up. We're probably going to just need to bring all that sewage up downstream of those screens. Next slide. So similar to the screening system, there's only one grit removal chamber at Ansonia, and so a second unit is recommended for redundancy. But again, it's also a great opportunity to redo the hydraulics there. And so we looked at some ways to tie into that line that's coming out of the influent pumps into the approach channel. The whole purpose of this was to see how much work it would take. All of these facilities have to be run 24/7, all the collection systems, plants, every single process. And so we wanted to make sure that we didn't just come up with this idea, okay, let's dump it all in Ansonia and walk away, right? So this is a little bit kind of goofy looking. We've got the channel going all the way up and around the existing unit. Mario and I had some good conversations about that. So I know that there are some creative ideas left to be determined on this, but in any case, again, a lot of nice gates that can be used for isolation, perfect for phasing in this work, and again, related to ultimately bringing in sewage from these other towns. So going back to the overall site plan here, one other system that we recommend upgrading just based on condition is the odor control system. There's an existing biofilter that has been inoperable for a while. And we recommend just putting in a radiocarbon odor control system, very easy to implement. But that's very much needed, and especially as more solids are being handled in that facility, that's going to be more critical than ever. So that we've positioned just left of the service building up there. There's a bit of an opening. And then this next slide I want to show you before I go there. Oh, sorry. Where the real challenges start at this plant is right around here, where we need to put in a new secondary clarifier, a new primary clarifier, and upgrading the one of the old contact basins to a UV channel. There's a single UV channel there that needs to be. We need to add another one for redundancy. Right now, there's no way to do any maintenance on that thing, so you'd be losing your disinfection. So fortunately, there's a channel works in the ground. The real challenge is making it all work again while the plant's running. I've heard it say it's like working on a Boeing 747 as it's flying through the air, kind of thing. You go to the next slide. So this is just kind of a very simple sketch of the existing yard piping plan. Some of these yellow boxes are temporary or relocated chambers that we could build around existing pipes, tie them in with water stop to these walls. And again, build everything while your systems are operating, and then add in those new units with the ability to bring them online. And then ultimately take old units offline to do any of those crossovers. And so that's what we did here. The existing effluent line, which is kind of going right here through the new primary tank, we'll likely need to upsize that line anyway. So it's a perfect chance just to put in the new line, put that into service, take the old one out, and then have room for your primary tank. So things like that. Again, without getting into any detail here, this was the work that we put in to really vet those assumptions that we made initially that, hey, yeah, this will work, as well as coming up with a schedule for this whole program. So that's the Ansonia plant work. On the pipelines, these two slides here show the routes between Derby and Ansonia and Seymour and Ansonia. Again, what we looked at there is upgrading the influent pump stations for each of those plants to be conveyance pump stations, as well as updating the screening system at Derby and the screening and grit removal system at Seymour. This slide here is from the report, just shows kind of a reconfiguration at the surface level of the Derby pump station. And you can see from it, it's a total reimagining, but you get kind of two benefits. It's a challenge to do this, but it actually allows you to use that facility and the pipes coming into it while you're doing the work itself. And so that's really the mindset we went in with this, is to make it work with the plants running. And as you'll see in a second, because the commissioning process is going to take so long, that's going to be essential. We can't take any chances saying, oh yeah, we'll turn it on overnight and everything will work great, you know. So this shows the overall conveyance corridor here. Around there in the middle, you can see the Ansonia plant. A little bit higher up there is the Seymour booster pump station, just to get that flow all the way down. We looked at, during task 3, we looked a lot at this routing, honestly, and that's because we wanted to put good costs to the conveyance. That was the brand new infrastructure. We didn't want to take too many chances with that, obviously. But this time we looked at part of those highway crossings, the railroad crossings, to come up with a good, feasible approach to those to make sure we didn't have to go to the highway and convince them to let us shut it down to open dig across. And that's what brought us to the end of task 4. And this drawing here shows the termination of these two pipelines at Ansonia as we laid it out, and kind of we'll call, the most conservative arrangement. There's an alternate pipeline route that we could look at going up Division Street that I think would work a little bit better, but we wanted to make sure we had solid assumptions here. But you can see this is a conceptual design drawing, and there's a lot more to look at, a lot more to optimize and economize, and a lot more challenges too that we haven't seen yet. So plenty more to look at, but we feel very good about where we're taking it. So the next slide here shows the schedule. This is what we developed off of all that work. 30 months for project planning and design. And that really, that gets us to the beginning of the Ansonia regional plant upgrade. You'll see there's a big gap between there and the pipeline work itself. And that's because the plant work will take longer. And that actually gives you this more time to kind of get at those easements and the property acquisitions, as well as the permitting. This is going to be a very permit exhaustive program. And then on the tail end of it, we wanted to make sure we had enough time for commissioning again, because the collection systems, all the pump stations in those collection systems, the plants themselves, at one point, they're all going to be operating at the same time, and they're going to be crossed over. And so we wanted to make sure we had enough time in there to accommodate all that. So with that, I'll hand it back to Mario unless there are any questions on the plant or the pipelines. Yeah, why not?
Do you remember our sludge tanks, our holding tanks? I didn't see them there.
Oh, yeah. So, sorry, I skipped right over that. So with the more solids coming in, and I understand that your sludge process doesn't work super great. So we decided that just to put in a brand new facility, one that's designed for the sludge that you have, one that's going to thicken it. We did a analysis of thickening versus dewatering, and thickening was the most cost effective. And so we found a place to kind of shoehorn that in on the other side in between the generators and the switchgear and the
Okay.
And then the idea being that would be put in commission, then you could demo out those two old digesters, which go pretty deep, and that's nice because that's where your new tank would go, the new secondary tank.
Thanks.
I'm going to switch now to some grant associated benefits. We know that Connecticut, through the Clean Water Fund, State Revolving Fund, offers a grant and loan program to communities for wastewater infrastructure for projects that the communities deem eligible for funding. So what we were interested in is we were wanting to understand what that did to the cost of the program, particularly how does it reduce the costs that I had shown you before on the overall present work slide. And for eligible projects, largely DEEP would offer a 20% grant and an 80% low interest loan. And, for certain facilities, like for nutrients, they'll offer more than a 20% grant. But right now, we just went with the umbrella 20. We didn't want to start getting too particular, or is it 22%, is it 23%? So we just bracketed it at 20% grant and at 80% low interest loan. And so everybody knows this, I believe, that does what we do, does what you folks do in the room. But we wanted to understand, we want to appreciate these grants and this attractive financial offering that the state does make available, and see how that would impact the work. And so, so I did say that there was a 20% grant and 80% loan available for municipalities and utilities. What we also know is that, we're no longer going to be 1, 2, or 3, but we're going to be a new collective 1 if the recommended plan takes hold, and if all of you in this room and beyond this room accept that this is the way these three communities want to continue operating. So a wastewater regional authority, with the Connecticut General Statute, Section 22A 500, is a great model that we found that we have had some experience with in Connecticut. And what this entity would be doing is it would basically be, I guess I'll just use the word, in charge of not only the regional plant at Ansonia, but also the conveyance pipelines that we'll identify and the collection systems. So to us, the benefit is that there's a higher grant percentage for a regional authority. It's a 25% loan instead of a 20% loan, like one of the gentlemen on the remote said. And we felt that even though it's an eligible project, and there's no question that the ones for a utility for our city or town would be an eligible project as well, but there are greater population and water quality commensurate benefits with a regional authority. You're going to have greater population and serve and commensurate water quality benefits. So depending on where the state is with its funding, your project might be more fundable with a regional plan. We saw that as an attractive point that we couldn't deny. We've seen that in state as well. So our recommendation would be that a regional entity be developed pursuant to Section 22A of the state code. We would also promote a full ownership of that. That way, this entity is in business to do wastewater treatment. That will be its sole function, to do wastewater treatment. And we feel that accountability will rest with them. With the more they own everything, so they can't say, yeah, but so-and-so didn't do what they were supposed to do. If this is the way of the future, let's develop something that's bulletproof. Of course, you folks have to make the decision, but we felt that it's a model that works in state. It's a model that we would stand behind as well if it's set up right and represented correctly with the right staff, which I believe that it will be. And so that accountability and that additional financial benefit was reasons why we would go with a full ownership setup for a regional authority. And so the last slide, what we did was we reran those numbers that we showed before but only this time taking into account the grant, the 25% grant. And the regional alternatives that we're showing here are the ones that are centered at Ansonia, and the one down below is the one that we've highlighted in blue, at least on my screen, is the recommended plan, and it becomes even more attractive. So that $22, $23 million to the good versus the base case becomes close to $28 million to the good. The others are also very good, but that one is the better of the bunch, if you will. And that, along with a greater water quality benefit because two outfalls would be removed, would be our basis for making that recommendation on a cost and an environmental basis. So that's what I had for our presentation. I'm sure that you folks have just recently gotten the report. So by all means, I know that this is, we want to get your comments, and we're going to be calling you here in the next week or so, just review things if you want. We can also sit down and review things with you, Mr. Thomasell. You were asking a number of questions on the details. We can make sure that you understand what we can bring it to a different level and what will.
I have another question. Maybe we're not at that point yet, but I was there when they built the plant 11 years ago. It's old already. I understand that. I didn't see a breakdown on cost for Ansonia. I mean, I would assume we would not be paying as much as the other two towns. Just assuming, because we pretty much have departmental in motion. Just wondering.
Yeah, so
You know.
John, what we're doing today is, we have two groups here. The engineering firm looking at the proper way to set up the infrastructure. And then the group from the Collins Center is gonna talk about funding and
All
administration.
right, that's really not my thing anyway,
That's
but
okay.
just as a taxpayer, I was wondering that.
Me
I live in
too.
Ansonia.
Me too.
Thank you.
Yeah, we
Thank you.
absolutely, yeah,
City,
we absolutely, that, yeah, we absolutely know that has to take place. We're just presenting the first part of it.
Yeah,
All those questions that you were asking are not gonna go away. They need to be addressed. They need to be
I'll just take
taken
it
on.
Thank you. Yeah, give me a call, shoot me an email, that's fine.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
If there's any other questions, we'll proceed from there.
You wanna say
No,
anything? Okay, good.
I'm great, unless. you want-
No,
why don't
that
you
was,
just go?
that was a good segue into the Collins Center's piece of this work, so thank you, Mario. And just to remind everybody what the Collins Center is, Collins Center for Public Management is located at UMass Boston, and we are a public agency. You know, we're a mission-driven consulting firm, and we do provide technical assistance and consulting services to municipalities and state governments and other public entities. I'm Sarah Concanon, like I said this morning, or earlier this afternoon rather. I am the Director of Municipal Services at the Collins Center, and I'm here with my colleague David Colton. He's the lead associate on our Public Works and Public Utilities practice. And we have been working as part of the team on this study, really focusing on the governance and organizational structure issues, and then taking Black and Beach's initial financial analysis a step further to understand how it impacts the three towns. Okay, next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of our agenda today, first we're going to talk about the ownership model recommendation. And if you recall, some of you may have been involved in our first workshop, we're gonna kind of recap that briefly. And then David's gonna move into talking about the various governance models and our recommendations around organizational structure, what the board would look like or could look like. And then I am going to begin the conversation about all of those financial questions that you're asking. And we're gonna start the conversation today, and then we're gonna have our third workshop to focus simply on what the findings of that are. But I wanted to lay the foundation today, make sure everybody's on the same page in terms of the assumptions and what goes into the calculation. And then we'll briefly touch on next steps. So, and then at the end, we're happy to answer any questions you have. If you get confused as we go along, just sort of jump in. But for substantive back and forth, we'll save that for the end. All right.
Thank you, Sarah. So just to kind of review, we held a workshop a while back, last fall, and we talked about the different ownership structures for regional authority and different rate structures. We talked about a full ownership, which Black and Beach has indicated that they prefer, and the full ownership with a retail rate. In other words, everybody in the district pays the same rate to the district. One rate for everybody, regardless of, without regard to their political border. And then we talked about the partial ownership model, which would be that the regional authority would own the treatment works, the conveyance system, the pumping system, but not the collection system. Collection system would remain with the individual municipalities, and in that model, a wholesale rate would be developed by the regional authority, which would be passed on to the member municipalities, who would then in turn add their collection system costs and develop a rate which they would charge their users. So those were the two those were the two ways we looked at it in the last workshop. Since that time, we've been considering a third option, which is a full ownership. In other words, the regional authority would own everything from the collection system to the conveyance system, all the way up to the treatment plant and the discharge. But the rate structure would be a wholesale rate structure. They would, instead of charging each of the individual users for the wastewater service, they would charge an assessment to each community. And then a different rate for each community would be developed. The reason why we find this attractive is that in some cases, this methodology would result in a greater equity, greater rate equity. You know, it's a little bit counterintuitive to say you're gonna have 3 different rates, but 3 different rates are more equitable than a single rate. But because of the need to reconcile measurement systems among the 3 communities, you may, doesn't in every case, but it can result in a more equitable system. Sarah's gonna get into that in a little bit more detail at the end. Of course, we agree with Black and Beach. We also recommend the full ownership model. We believe that the full ownership model is more likely to result in lower costs and greater ease in environmental compliance by having it all owned by the same entity, working with the regulatory agencies. The environmental compliance, it will be more easily met and will result in a lower cost to meet those requirements than if you tried to do it as 3 separate entities. At the bottom of this is the need for an equitable rate design. It's not, we're not designing the final rate. We don't have enough information to do that, but equity should be the goal here in terms of the rate. And that rate design is going to be a very, very important component. If should you choose to regionalize, it's going to be very complex discussion that you're going to have with each other over the rate design. Next slide. So I think I already talked about this a little bit, the full ownership model and how that works. Customer service, and we can go to the next slide. And this was a diagram you might remember from the first workshop. Kind of it graphically shows you how a full ownership would work. You have a regional WPCA over there represented in the square on the right, and the residents and businesses represented on the left. The shadow up there at the top is the 3 currently existing WPCAs. They disappear, and the relationship changes so that it's between the regional authority and the ultimate user. Next slide. To do our analysis, we looked at how regional authorities are governed and how they're organized, what their structures are across southern New England. And this map it represents a number of those districts. These are the ones we actually looked at. There are more in southern New England, but these are the ones we felt were the best ones to look at. As you can see from the map, or maybe you can't see the history, but historically, the first to regionalize were the big urban areas. You can see Boston area, Hartford, Providence, Rhode Island. Those were the areas that first regionalized, and that kind of spread out to the other more urbanized areas. One of our findings here is that these districts, in the way that they're structured and the way they're organized, don't have a lot in common when you get down to the details. Size-wise, how they form their boards, how they run their day-to-day operation, how they assess fees. we looked at 12 districts, there's 12 different ways of doing that. The closest comparison that we could find to what is proposed here, a 3-town district, which would be somewhere around just under 4 MGD, is a small district in Massachusetts in the towns of Mansfield, Foxborough, and Norton, which is about 3.2 MGD. And so that's in our report, that's a district that we're going to reference quite a bit in terms of the comparison. One major difference between that group and this proposed district is that, like many of these districts, there's one town or city that dominates. You know, Hartford, New Haven, Boston, Providence. In the Mansfield, Foxborough one, it's Mansfield. They're over 60% of the flow. So they have the lion's share. You don't have that situation here, although you're not exactly the same, the 3 communities. They're a lot closer. There's a lot more about you that is homogeneous when you look at flow characteristics, when you look at the condition of the system, when you look at the number of connections, when you look at the water consumption, you're a lot closer together. You have a lot more in common than many of the cities and towns that make up these other districts do. Next slide. So what we're recommending, we also are recommending, we agree with Black and Beach, that the Connecticut model legislation is the way to go. We looked at other forms of legislation. Almost all of the districts, for example, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, are set up by special legislation as opposed to a model legislation. And some of the districts in Connecticut, NVC, of course, Naugatuck+Valley, for example, are set up by special legislation. The major the reason why we do not favor special legislation is because of the time it would take to negotiate all of those terms. You'd be starting from scratch, you'd be putting something together. You'd have to negotiate that, you'd have to get somebody to sponsor it, you'd have to get it to the legislature. It would just slow things down, where now you already have existing legislation that you can simply adopt. The Connecticut model legislation requires that you have concurrent ordinances and bylaws, as well as an operating plan. We looked at other ways of doing it, where cities and towns do it by interlocal agreement. They might have special legislation with interlocal agreement, and they have separate ordinance, separate sewer use rules. Those don't seem to work as well as the districts that have a single set of rules that all of the towns operate under. Next slide. So the reason, these are the main reasons why we recommend the Connecticut model regional statute. It has an established track record. It's in existence. It's used most notably in New Haven, right down the road. It's also used in, there's a small district up in the northeast corner of the Bolton Lakes district where it's also used. So it's in use. It has a track record. As I said earlier, big reason it's timely. Creating special legislation with the way creation of the district unnecessarily in our view. It meets all the established criteria. You don't have to reinvent everything. It's all there. It gives everything you need to, everything you need to know all in one place. The grant funding, of course, by operating under the Connecticut statute, it automatically makes you eligible for the money, right? And the additional 25% funding that Mario was, 5% funding that Mario was talking about. And it's also comprehensive. It includes financing, language about land acquisition, project planning, construction, staff selection. It's a comprehensive law. If any of you have ever tried to read it, it is voluminous. It has everything that you would possibly need to set up a regional wastewater system. Next slide. So under the law, how would you establish a regional water authority? Each community, through their legislative body, would have to take concurrent action and adopt an identical ordinance. We will, in our final report, we will be providing a draft of that ordinance that we recommend be adopted. And that ordinance, in effect, starts the clock on creating the WPCF, the Regional Water Control Authority. Approval is required. Both the ordinance and a preliminary plan of operation need to be approved by the DEEP commissioner and the state treasurer. And the state treasurer is, of course, very important because that has to do with the funding. Right? It has, in order to be eligible for that extra 5%, the state treasurer has to sign off. The ordinance would establish a board of directors that would adopt sewer rules and regulations and hire officers. And there would be a bylaw required that would talk about how what the powers and duties of the board. It would spell out other considerations as well, the organization structure of the WPCA. We recommend that both the ordinance and an initial set of bylaws be adopted by each community, an identical set of documents. And that the bylaws contain language, and that's another draft that we will be providing, will contain language on how those bylaws get amended, so that you don't have to go back to 3 city or town councils to get approval of changes to your bylaws. So the next 2 slides, they're hard to read. This presentation will be available online. So this lists all of the other boards of directors for the other regional authorities that we looked at and how they look at and how many members they have and so forth. And really the big takeaway from this is that there is no cookie cutter way to do this. There's no format that's not done the same way. It's done a different way in every jurisdiction. For example, the largest regional water pollution control authority, if you will, in the region, the MWRA, has a very small board of directors, only 11 people. Whereas Naugatuck, for example, which is far smaller than MWRA, has 15 people. So there's no discernible cap. Most have unbalanced representation, but we are recommending a balanced board, 3 members from each community. And that goes back to what I talked about a little earlier in terms of the level of towns here are more alike than they are different. We couldn't justify, we couldn't find any difference between the three that would justify an additional member for any one of the municipalities. We would be recommending 3-year staggered terms, the same method of appointment as currently done in individual towns. But we'd also recommend, since we're recommending a balanced board, in order to protect the minority point of view, in order to prevent 2 towns from, in effect, ganging up on a 3rd town, enforcing their will, we could have a supermajority required for the important votes, setting the rates, approving the budget, issuing debt. Those kind of votes would require 6 votes and 1 member from each town, at least 1 member from each town, so that it would take a consensus, a real consensus to get that passed. And agreement, real agreement among the 3 towns. The directors, there are eligibility requirements, but the major ones are the directors must reside in the district and have relevant environmental, engineering, or financial knowledge and experience to be on the board of directors. Those are our recommendations for the makeup of the board. There are some key provisions in the ordinance and bylaws that I want to talk about. The board would appoint officers, 3 officers, an executive director, a treasurer, and board secretary. Everybody else in the organization would be appointed by the executive director. Budgeting, the budget would be budgeted, both capital and operating needs would be prepared by the executive director, approved by the board. There would be an annual requirement for a cost of service study, so that there was transparency prior to setting the rate on what it costs to operate and maintain and improve the system. There would be the requirement of an annual audit, and there would be a requirement of the sewer rules and regulations to be adopted by the board of directors and amended by the board of directors. With that, that's hopefully I didn't go too quickly through that, but those are our recommendations as far as governance and organizational structure for the proposed district. And
I have
Sarah?
a question.
Go ahead.
We have a timeline for the project itself. Is there a timeline for this? Because that other timeline doesn't start until this gets done, right?
Right. I mean, this would, this can happen. One of the reasons, as I said, we're proposing you adopt the Connecticut statute, and rather than special legislation, you can do it immediately. You can get at the end of the study, we're going to give you a draft of an ordinance and a draft of a bylaw. So you can get rolling right away. It shouldn't be too much in the way of getting that done. Our bylaw and our ordinance are based on existing bylaws and ordinances, nothing extraordinary about them. Even the supermajority requirements you'll find in other bylaws, in other ordinances, in other districts. So shouldn't be anything. I know I've been local government a long time. I know controversy can be around any corner, but it shouldn't be anything too terribly controversial.
I have kind of related to that. And maybe you could cover it when I have to step out, but does the legislative body in the town have the decision making, or does it have to go to a referendum?
No, it's the legislative authority in the town that adopts.
Under that statute.
Right, because it makes a big difference.
Under that
Anything that has to go to referendum is quite different.
I just wanted to jump in for a second, David. So just to answer the question about timing and schedule. Look, this is a stakeholder group. if the stakeholder group recommends something, and we would hope it would, we would think it would have to be all three towns would recommend it on the stakeholder. If that were to occur, I think what we do is we set a time limit under the statute for the towns to adopt the ordinances. Once all three towns adopt the ordinance, then that triggers everything else to go forward. So, you know, you could say, you know, this is relevant, this recommendation is relevant for 2 years. And if within 2 years, all three towns adopt the ordinance, then we move forward. If they don't, or if they don't act in a reasonable amount of time, then it's going to die. You know, but it's the three legislative bodies acting independently to adopt the ordinance that's the trigger. Sorry.
I was gonna say, I was gonna jump back into the cost benefit.
Yes, so, I know that everyone is probably eager to see what it's going to cost them in their community. But we felt it was really important to sort of lay the groundwork, because this is not, this is an important piece of the work that we all have been doing together. And so understanding what you're going to see next time is important to us. So I'm going to walk you through sort of the introduction to the analysis that we've been working on. And I hope that you'll ask questions so that you can understand what we'll be looking at and talking about next time. So first, let's start with the scope of work. So this language is from the contract that we had signed with with NVCOG a year and a half ago, approximately. So we were to perform the analysis to compare the capital and O&M costs of the preferred alternatives with the base cases for any jurisdiction that's part of the regional alternative, so your three communities. And also model the costs to each of those jurisdictions under a wholesale rate setting procedure. Since we've gotten into the project, we've sort of just decided that the wholesale rate structure may or may not be the preferred model. So we have been designing the analysis to accommodate either a wholesale model or a retail rate model. And we'll talk about that more later. But the other note to know is that our work is really built on the work that Black and Beach has done. But we've also been working independently, and there are different goals that we have, and I think that NVCOG had for bringing us in than working with Black and Beach. Next slide, please. So what are the goals and limitations of the work that we've been doing? So we kind of see three overarching goals for the analysis. First, it should be comprehensive, so that as much as possible, everything that we can know, that we can quantify in terms of the financial implications of the regionalization, all of those things are captured. It should also be valid, and in order to make it sure that it's valid, we really need to have an apples to apples comparison. And it needs to be equitable. When we were thinking about how to treat certain costs, we defaulted to the most equitable option. Now, there's a lot of, as everyone's been alluding, this is really a conversation that the three communities need to have together, because there may be some decisions that you'll have to make about how costs are shared. In terms of limitations, you know, although we strive to be as comprehensive as possible, there are some things that we don't know yet, or that we can't quantify yet. So there are certain things that are not included in the analysis. Just some examples, you know, we don't know what it will cost to decommission or transition some of that infrastructure. And we don't know what future regulatory costs may be placed upon the regional WPCA. Next slide, please. So the next two slides sort of go through the assumptions that we've made as we've built our model. So first, we've got assumptions about the timeline, and this is something that can be easily changed if we need to, but right now our model is built so that the model assumes that the regional WPCA is formed in this upcoming fiscal year, and that collection system, phase one collection system investment as defined by Black and Beach will begin fairly immediately, with debt repayment beginning the following year, FY23. In terms of the pumping station treatment and conveyance capital work, we have set up this schedule, which I think is a little bit more optimistic maybe than Black and Beaches, so we should probably default to theirs because they know best. But we have had, the structure we've been working with is FY23 is some engineering work, construction in 24 and 25, and debt repayment beginning in 26. So I don't think we're too far apart though. Our next assumption has to do with those O&M costs and how we project them. So the model relies on the O&M costs that were projected by Black and Beach, which are annualized using the same methodology for every scenario. Now, in some cases, there is a material difference between the budgets of the existing WPCAs and what that projection for O&M costs showed. We think that that's because in part, the Black and Beach numbers are based on some industry standard practices and some assumptions and cost assumptions and things like that. We did add a 9% adjustment in the end to Black and Beach's numbers to account for some things that we felt were not included. But the bottom line is we feel lucky to have the Black and Beach numbers because it allows us to do an apples to apples comparison. Because although you have your budgets, you only have your budgets for the status quo. And we don't have an O&M budget for the regional authority or really for the base case because the base case is not the status quo. There are some improvements and changes that are included in a base case scenario, but are not in the status quo. The next assumption was about the existing debt and the future capital costs. So we rely on the information that the communities provided us about their existing debt service, and we use projected capital costs from Black and Beach's analysis. We did treat phase 2 collection system costs as pay as you go, which means you're paying for that work in cash versus issuing debt. And we felt comfortable doing that because of the scale of that number. It wasn't very big. And then we also added some spending, pay as you go, again, spending for non-infrastructure capital, things like vehicles. And we use a 3% of the O&M budget for all scenarios. So that's another difference on the capital side. In terms of the structure of the debt, so we were projecting annual debt service. We assume that all debt will be issued through the Clean Water Fund, and it will be for a 20-year term at 2% interest. We did not model borrowing costs or short-term debt that might be used during the construction phase. That will be something that you could model closer to the actual commencement of such work. All right.
Is it safe to say though that you use different assumptions, but you're using them for all the cases? So though it might be a little different than what Black and Beach came up with, it's still all going to be apples to apples comparison across the different scenarios, right?
That's right. Yep. So any adjustments we make to say Black and Beach's numbers, for example, adding that non-infrastructure capital is applicable to all scenarios. So it wouldn't change the relative impact, but the next assumption has to do with the financial incentives, and I won't belabor this, but it's essentially what Mario has already explained to you, the 20% incentive for a single jurisdiction WPCA and a 25% for a regional. Now, the way that we have modeled it is that it's an annual reimbursement as a percentage of debt service payments. So we'll have to just confirm with Deep that that's the way that it would be structured. The next assumption has to do with how costs are apportioned or shared amongst the three communities. So in the regional system, we are modeling the apportionment of the costs based on the average annual flow that's forecasted by Black and Beach.
Can I actually jump in for one
Sure.
second? So some of you know that NVCOG is also working on other funding sources for this consolidation. We've been in conversations with members of Congress about it, and we've actually made requests for congressionally directed spending regarding the collection system and the connecting of the collection systems. 50, what do we ask for? 57 million?
Yes.
Okay. So those are not in these calculations, and I just wanted to be clear about that. This is for comparison. They're giving you the full case in their analysis. If we are successful in acquiring other funds through other sources, that'll come off the top and be shared to you. I'm sorry.
No, that's a good point. And there also are potentially some other choices that we have made, smaller choices that default to the more conservative analysis, just so that you all know. So then the last two assumptions here, the first one, the funds held in reserve. So to the extent that any of the existing WPCA hold any stabilization funds or reserve funds that, for example, a capital reserve fund or something like that, those are not accounted for in the model. Those would remain with the local, the existing WPCA or the municipality to be used for whatever legal purpose they want to use it for. And then finally, on the strength of influence, the model does not, I think David made this point, or somebody did, the model does not account for differing costs of treatment for sewage based on its strength, because it's our understanding that it's all fairly comparable. Okay, questions on the assumptions? Okay. So now what I want to move to is explaining to you what you'll see next time. So we've modeled two different ways of looking at the analysis. So first is the total annual cost analysis. So it basically will show for each municipality what the total annual cost to participate in the regional alternative or for the base case. And the regional alternative scenario will be modeled under full ownership.
Excuse me, I have one question on the stuff we just did.
Okay.
Sarah, in the existing debt, did that say it's going to be incorporated into the regional
Yes.
area?
Yes. That's what we're having conversations about, yeah.
And so if they're, so would that be equalized then across all municipalities, or how does that work?
So that's what we spent a couple hours on the phone about 2 weeks ago. So the question of equalization of current investment and the value of infrastructure contributed to the regional system is really the harder calculation to make, but it has to be done. We're looking at operations and maintenance. We're looking at investment in new infrastructure. We're assuming the assumption of existing debt by the regional authority. But Ansonia, for instance, has an asset that they paid for over the last decade. Derby has neglected to invest in their asset for a long period of time. Seymour is due to make a major investment in their asset. So we have to find a way to equalize that, because if we just run the straight numbers, it looks like Derby, this huge benefit accrues to the users in Derby or to the residents in Derby, and actually even a marginal cost to Ansonia. So there's got to be an equalization of all those factors in this, and that is the part we're going to struggle with. I'll be honest with you, in the school consolidation study, that's what we're struggling with.
Yeah.
Getting between those points. Well,
Okay,
we're committed to getting there.
Okay, so that there wouldn't be like a bill from Ansonia and then a bill from the regional. All of these things would be incorporated into one scenario if we regionalize.
Yeah, we also have to address the full versus partial ownership matters a little more closely. We sort of skimmed through it today, but we have a situation where Ansonia City owns the collection system, WPCA owns the plant, Derby, WPCA owns both, and in Seymour, it's unclear, I think, or maybe the town owns everything.
Okay.
So we've also got to deal with that, and and when we talk about equalization, we have to figure out how to look at the value of the collection system and the deferred maintenance relative to each system coming into the whole. So I mean, it's a lot. It may be. I know my friends on the line from OPM are not gonna love hearing me say this, but it may be an additional whole level of study required. But we're not there yet. And
Okay, we can continue on. Thank you, though.
You're also not alone. When we've done these for other places, these are all common things that you kind of have to address and kind of figure out, the best path forward.
But it's safe to say that for the purposes of our analysis as it stands today, we're all in the region, right? Everything goes into the regional bucket. Between now and the final workshop, we'll continue to work on that refined national plans and work with NVCOG and others on that issue. But as it stands today, we're doing it all in.
it may also be worthwhile for us before the next stakeholder meeting, maybe to have a finance meeting.
Yes.
A financial, meeting of finance representatives from towns or from WPCF. That may.
So turning back to the slide that we have before us, I just wanted to include this note to really get folks to understand how will what we show you be different from what you just saw from Black and Beach. So when they were talking about the cost comparison that they did to identify the present worth of the various scenarios and to demonstrate the savings with the regional alternatives. So first, our costs will be laid out on an annual basis. And they won't be reported in the aggregate. They'll be assigned to each of the three communities. Ours includes that adjusted O&M number, which is a sort of a small change. Ours also incorporates all of the existing debt service, and that, as we just kind of talked about, that's a big nut to crack, and so we're still working on that. Our analysis will amortize all the future debt for the capital investment to show what the annual debt service payment will be, not necessarily that you're going to spend 50 million on a project, but that it's going to be, 2.1 million per year. And then finally, we've got that additional non-infrastructure capital. Again, a small amount of money, but still it's in there. But to your point, it applies to all scenarios. All right. So this next slide, I think, gets to the heart of the question that was just asked. Luckily, this table looks a lot simpler now that we've taken off partial ownership. But essentially, in the base case, all of the costs that are out there, future costs, current costs, are just assigned to the municipality or the local WPCA. In terms of all the new capital, there's that 20% deep grant, that financial incentive. On the region, under the full ownership model, all of the expenses are apportioned by flow, and there's a 25% deep grant. Now, the conversation we just had was about that line that says existing debt. Our default in the model is to apportion it by flow, to bring it all into the region and apportion it by flow. Rick alluded to the fact that this creates a little bit of a challenge because Derby has substantial new debt, and that really makes the financial picture look very different. And so we have tested our model in different ways by taking the existing debt and not regionalizing it. But those are conversations that, as Rick said, I think we need to have with the leadership and the financial team of the existing entities, because there are lots of different ways to approach it. And we don't want to have to model every single one. We can't model every single one. So we'll decide what the most promising, the same way that Black and Beach sort of funneled options down and down. We'll go through that process kind of in miniature when we think about some of the financial options we have. And then we'll work the model to make sure we can show what those costs would be. All right. The second analysis we're going to show you is a cost recovery rate. We're going to calculate a rate to recover costs for each municipality and for each scenario for the period of the study, which is 20, 25 years, something like that, under the full ownership structure. And it's going to be essentially the cost to the annual total cost per 100 cubic feet of billable water. As you know, the billable water consumption is frequently used as a proxy for consumer sewage use, and to some extent, the 3 current rate designs that you have use this methodology. Sometimes with a flat fee on top and capital fee, things like that. So the cost recovery rate is not the same as the rate that the user may ultimately be billed. You know that, and we want to make the point and have it on our PowerPoint, because if this is out publicly and there's a user who doesn't understand that, they may be surprised. Why is this the case? Well, there are rate design features such as, monthly flat fees or an inclined block rate structure that will change their ultimate rate that they're billed. And also you will have offsetting revenues, from well users, for example, and other offsetting revenues. Offsetting revenues are not projected in our model. So those will be sort of off the top of the rate.
But those are relatively minor in this.
Typically, I mean, they can be as much as 10%. Some of those offsetting revenues, but that's offsetting revenue is any revenue you collect that you don't collect by the user fee, like permitting fees and other. You might get a small grant. You might get I believe there's a nitrogen credit that you get from the state. In some cases, there are different kinds of revenues that would factor into that.
But in some cases also, an authority may use stabilization fund monies or reserved funds, or in Massachusetts they call it retained earnings. Those monies to offset rates, and those are one-time, revenues. Those are things that could be substantial, but are sort of more of the political side of things, would be incorporated in our analysis.
And also on the not included in the rate, the difference between the cost recovery rate will show in our actual rate is we're not going to take into account industrial rates. Industrial, depending on what kind of pre-treatment program you have, depending on what kind of industry you have, you might have a different rate methodology to recover costs from industry than you would from a residential.
Right. So our cost recovery rate will be sort of a more simple approach to it. So this slide sort of walks through the differences between what we have called the retail rate structure and the wholesale rate hybrid structure. Now, the wholesale rate hybrid structure is where you've got the full ownership plus the wholesale rate. The processes are fairly simple, but I want to make sure everyone is clear because this becomes an important point on the next slide. So under the retail rate structure, all of the costs are added together. All of the billable water is added together. And then the total cost is divided by the total billable water. And that creates one single rate that's applicable to all of the users, whether they live in Derby, Ansonia, or Seymour. On the other hand, under the wholesale rate structure, all of the costs would be aggregated. Then those costs would be apportioned to each of the towns. And then each municipality's cost would be divided by its billable water, which would result in potentially 3 different rates for each user. Each community's user. Yes, yeah.
Each user would have one rate. But
Correct. Yes. Right. Thank you. So, the retail rate structure can be preferred because it is simple. It's simple to administer. It makes sense to people. And people perceive it as equitable because there's a single rate that everybody pays. But on the other hand, the wholesale rate structure, especially when it's coupled with the full ownership model, has some certain benefits. So first, it will address any differences in how efficiently billable water is measured and any subsequent inequities between users in different municipalities. We're going to talk about that next. We're going to end on that high note. But the wholesale rate structure allows us to address that potential problem. It also allows each municipality to have some local control over the rate design. So the regional authority could assess the community, and each community could then decide how to recover its rates. One may want to have no flat fee, one may want to have a high flat fee. There are certainly differences of opinion in terms of rate design. And and for the wholesale hybrid model, it still allows the regional WPCA to be structured under a full ownership model, which we've already talked about, is not only preferred by regulatory agencies, but has a lot of benefits in terms of being able to see the system, the whole system holistically, and do what's best writ large for the system. And there are certainly financial benefits, but also other benefits to that design. Okay, so this is this is nearing the end here. So thanks for sticking with us here. So we have faced challenges in modeling the retail rate structure. And I want to try to explain to you why. So to make sure that there's intermunicipal equity when you use the retail rate structure in a regional model where you've got different municipalities receiving their drinking water from different sources with different metering systems. You need to make, so to ensure that there's intermunicipal equity, you should see billable water pretty close to proportionally accurate. But we have some concerns that this may not be the case here. So the two graphs that you see sort of show this without really diving into the details. So on a high level, on the left, we're showing you the average annual flow from 2015 to 2017 in MGD.
That's wastewater.
The wastewater flow, yep. And on the right is the 2020 reported billable water in 100 cubic feet. So in both graphs, Ansonia is represented in the pie chart by the blue, Derby by the orange, and Seymour by the gray. So, you know, you would assume that that these two pie charts should be relatively close, so that Ansonia's wastewater flow should be fairly close to its billable water percentage. So you can see Ansonia is 40.9% of the total average annual flow from that time period, 37.5% of the 2020 billable water. That's reasonably close. But when we look at Derby and Seymour, we see wider disparities. So the orange again is Derby. They account for approximately 34% of the wastewater flow for that time period, but only about 29% of the total billable water. And then for Seymour, 25% of the wastewater flow, but 34% of the billable water. So we've talked about this with the engineers, and we've sort of brainstormed the different reasons that this could be happening. There are a lot of different things I think that could be contributing to it. But the bottom line for our analysis is that if we were to use a retail rate structure, what it shows us is Seymour paying significantly higher rates under that single rate structure because of the billable water differences.
Higher rates than you would expect. You looked at the wastewater flow, you would expect the rate to be at a certain level, but when you apply it to billable water, because it's proportionally out of whack, Seymour built.
To be clear though, everybody would still pay the same rate. It's a higher rate
The higher
as
total
compared to
Base.
flow.
cost, it would be a higher total cost.
Right, but everybody would still be paying the same rate per cubic foot.
They would still be
of
paying
water.
the same rate per cubic foot,
In
but
everything.
what
Yes.
this shows us is that there is a disconnect in how the water is measured. So that if you compare if you took this a step further, compare number of connections, population, sewer population, those numbers are very close together too for the three municipalities, whereas the billable water is not. So there's something going on here. That we need to reconcile before we can provide a retail rate.
Right, so for this phase of the work that you all are engaged in, we think that modeling a cost recovery rate using that wholesale structure, which is again, that full ownership with a wholesale rate structure, may be the most accurate, equitable, and useful analysis for you all to consider. Now, that doesn't mean, to David's point about the retail rate, we could get to the bottom of this, and you may decide, you know what, let's get to the bottom of this. But that will probably involve much deeper analysis of what's going on with the data to understand why there appear to be those differences. And really it demonstrates the need for the cost of services study and to really understand how your rate will be structured.
There's a whole long list of reasons that this could be happening, and it's going to take some real granular analysis to find out, to reconcile those numbers.
So I hesitate to go any deeper into it. Anyone here is free to disagree with me. It's either the way the water is billed by the different water companies to the towns, or it may have to do with I&I in that the flow is off and the water's and the use of water is accurate. I don't know, but we don't know, all right?
And it could be how, for example, I'll just give you one quick example. One of the municipalities does not count summer usage in its billable water. I think it's Derby, right? Or is it?
Derby, I know we don't.
Seymour uses
Winter. Seymour uses winter only.
we don't count some.
Right,
But I think they
you
all-
use winter only, yet your billable water is so much higher than as would be expected by your number of connections. So there's something amiss.
Yeah.
Right?
We did try to dig down a little bit into, to see if we could get the actual billable water for those summer months that are not counted. We did not see a clear solution or explanation. It may have to do with the efficiency of the meters, but again, that's not on you guys, that's with the other water companies. So there's a lot to disentangle there, and we don't want to bog down the analysis by arguing over that, because at the end of the day, the question can be answered using the wholesale rate structure. It can be answered accurately and fairly, all the while knowing that if we want to get to that single rate model, you can. It just will take a little bit of extra work. Okay, what questions do you guys have on that? All right, we'll think about it for a minute, and then if you have more questions.
What year's data was that based off of?
So the flow data was 2015 to 2017. That was the actual flow average stuff. And then it was the 2020 billable water.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it was a 2020 billable water that you lost last year.
And the reason that it impacts the analysis is that we use the 2020 billable water as the basis for our billable water projections. And you all used that flow data in part as a basis for your flow projection. So it carries into the future in the analysis.
But I mean, it's also possible that one town is underbilling their rate, their flow of water. It's possible. Because that would move the percentages away. I think it's interesting that Ansonia is consistent, or relatively consistent between the two.
And it's an opportunity, right? When you do the full cost of service analysis, a lot of that stuff's looked into. Not only that, it also tell you your cost assumptions that you're using. And I mean, a cost of service analysis will provide lots of information to the communities and why you kind of recommend doing that before, you would even move forward, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that, as you saw with Black and Beach's presentation, we started up here, we're getting closer and closer and closer, but this is not going to get us to the end. You still have work to do to get more and more detail before you have final.
And this is a final thought on that, just to sort of dot the I here. This isn't uncommon. There are plenty of regional authorities out there that use some kind of hybrid rate assessment model for this very reason. They either can't or they don't want to expend the resources to fix the underlying problem and make it equitable on a single rate. It may be that because they're like, the Boston area is 43 communities, and there's no way you're gonna make all 43 cities and towns in MWRA get on the same rate. It may be another reason in another town, in another district, but it's not an uncommon problem to have, and it's not uncommon that it be solved with a hybrid assessment model.
Okay,
Any questions online? Anyone who's remote with a question? Oh,
Black and Beach. If this does go through and stuff like that, are we looking at a 24/7 manned plant? Or does it we're all 7 to 3 right now? You know, I know these bigger places go with operators 24/7 around the clock.
It would basically, we still see this as an 8-hour, 1-shift operation with good, strong automation.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I just want to come back to this last slide, just so that you all know what our next steps are for the Collins Center. So as I said, we're gonna have one final workshop. We're still working out the date because we do want to have an interim conversation with the local finance teams to talk about some of the debt questions around the existing debt. That workshop will be solely, I think, focused on the findings of the financial analysis that we've been doing. That's when you'll see the numbers, and we can talk through what they're showing, and again, always in light of the assumptions and limitations of the work. And then at that point, we'll also summarize all of our recommendations, and then we'll be working on our final report after we take that step, and then I think there'll be an additional public presentation of the entire project. So if there are other questions, we'd be happy to talk through them now.
The folks online have been somewhat quiet today, so if there's anyone from Deep, OPM, or any of the municipalities we haven't heard, if you have any questions, please speak up.
I have a question, and it's a complicated one. You know, each town has its own employees. What happens? I mean, you might as well.
you had to
spell it
ask that
out.
today, right?
No, well,
Keep Ansonia, that's where we're going.
Oh, okay.
I'm tired, I have no problem.
There are other statutes that we have to contend with in regard to the treatment of bargaining unit employees and the consolidation of a facility or regional facilities. But I think the working assumption right now is that you have a significant collection system and 3 plants, and that, you know, one operation could be cobbled together through attrition and retirement over a relatively short period of time.
but is it the new regional authority that makes that decision?
Eventually. Yeah, eventually.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I don't think is covered by the statute. I think that's something that you'd have to, as a.
Yeah, I just thought I'd throw it out now because it's a significant.
And that may change. There are 2 bills pending right now that would impact that. So I don't know if they're coming out or not in the next couple days. But yeah, I think the answer to your question is yes. If there's the formation of a regional authority, then they would have to inherit all of the assets, including
Yeah, again, it's a different,
Bargaining
because you got
agreements.
different bargaining.
Yeah, but that has to be bargained.
Right.
I don't want to be, you know, I don't want you to think that it's just automatic. They would have to bargain all of those individual agreements. Anyone else?
Is it possible to get a copy of this PowerPoint and also the MP4 of this meeting to the members here?
Yeah. Rich, do you
The
want to?
video will be available on YouTube tomorrow.
Okay.
So it's on the Naugatuck+Valley COG YouTube channel. If you don't have it, you can find it from our website. But the, where are you gonna post the, PowerPoints? We don't,
I was gonna say I can post them on the study page and then send a link to all the stakeholders that are invited.
great, well, you send the YouTube link to it.
So all stakeholders will be notified, everyone here as well as the people who weren't able to get here today. A link to the YouTube presentation was being recorded right now and the full PowerPoint presentations.
Okay, and I'm gonna reference the earlier question on the savings by community and add to, there are also savings to the state in this, so I would assume that partial would be the cities, but the state or federal government would also have savings. And that would be part of the numbers that you're talking about, is that correct?
It's not part of the model, but yes, there is, there are always savings for the funders in the consolidation of systems, I shouldn't say always, but generally. So it should, look, this only works if everybody saves money, the water quality improves, and we manage to stabilize or even reduce user fees. Those are the three factors. And if we can't achieve at least two of the three or all three of those, then we probably don't have a viable concept. But I think to David's point, David hit on it earlier a couple of times, the savings and the value to the state and federal governments, as well as the municipalities, in the enhancement of water quality and the potential the environment are not insignificant, and we would hope that they would both participate at a higher level in a project like this to achieve those outcomes.
Okay, I'll wait to see the numbers. Thank you, though.
I know you will, Rich.
Sorry.
No. Wow. And if we do have a finance call, which I'm gonna push for if we can manage to put it together, I really would encourage you to participate in that, Rich.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. John?
Unless anyone else has any questions, we really appreciate you coming today. Don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any future questions on it, but we'll be sending out the links tomorrow.
I just want to thank all the consultants for being here in person today. It's good to see everyone in the flesh again. And, appreciate all your time. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. 3 o'clock exactly, you guys.
Yeah.